I take this time to urge my colleagues to support Senate Joint Resolution 68 that we will be voting on, as I understand, tomorrow. The resolution that was introduced by Senator Kaine, I want to acknowledge Senator Kaine's long-standing commitment to the United States Senate and Congress carrying out our constitutional responsibilities as it relates to the authorization for the use of military force, that rests solely with the Congress of the United States, and we have a responsibility to speak as to that authority. In the last Congress with Senator Flake, their efforts on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was an effort to try to bring us together in regards to the passage of an AUMF, an authorization for the use of military force, because we had seen successive administrations using our military without authorization from Congress. So Senate Joint Resolution 68 is aimed at one specific conflict in which we can come together, and I'm optimistic that we'll be able to act on this resolution. It deals with the use of force in Iran, and it's very specific as to say that unless explicitly authorized by a declaration of war or a specific authorization for the use of military force against Iran, there is no authority to use our military against Iran. Now, it has, for certainly legitimate reasons, that the president can use force to defend ourselves from an imminent attack. That's certainly how I think all of us perceive the authorization from force for Congress needs to be qualified. In the case of an urgent situation, the president can in fact act. Now, why do we need this resolution passed now? Well, I need not tell my colleagues that there's a heightened sense of tension between the United States and Iran. It's been building for some time, but certainly the Soleimani action in taking in the U.S. military action in which General Soleimani was killed. He was the leader of the coup force in Iran. He was taken out by our U.S. military. That has presented a heightened tension between the United States and Iran. Congress has the sole responsibility to commit our troops to combat. It's in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Congress has the power to declare war. This is not a decision made by the president. It's a decision made by Congress. Our founders were very concerned about having the appropriate balance between the executive branch and the legislative branch. It's called checks and balances. We did not want a monarchy. We wanted to make sure that there was sufficient support before war was declared, that it's in our national security interest that the Congress and the president and the American people are all together in an effort if we're going to have war against another country. And that war should always, the use of military should always be a matter of last resort, that we should always exhaust diplomacy. We should always exhaust other means before America initiates war against another country or the use of military force. This authority that rests in Congress was tested in the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was passed by Congress during the Vietnam conflict at the early stages to give the president the authority to use force to defend our military against attacks coming from Vietnam. It was never intended to lead us into an active, prolonged war, but as we know, it was used by successive administrations for a prolonged war in Vietnam. I think historians would agree that that was an abuse of the interpretation of authorization, that the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was never intended for offensive military operations in Vietnam, but it was used for that purpose. So Congress in 1973 took action to make sure this would never happen again. They passed what's known as the War Powers Act. Now, the War Powers Act was passed by strong bipartisan vote in both the House and Senate. It was vetoed, and the Congress overrode the veto of the president because we knew that it's our responsibility to commit our troops to a battle. So what does the War Powers Act require? Well, it requires first consultation with both Congress, by the President with Congress in every possible instance before committing troops to war. That's the exact language in the War Powers. There's consultation requirements. Then there has to be reporting within 48 hours of American troops sent into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances. And then third, the War Powers Act requires an end of foreign military action after 60 days unless Congress provides a declaration of war or an authorization for the operation to continue, an authorization for use of military force, an AUMF. So why do we need Senate Joint Resolution 68 if we have the War Powers Act? Well, like Vietnam, now in Iran, the president is usurping the constitutional powers of Congress by saying he has certain authorities that go well beyond what was intended in the Constitution or the War Powers Act. Now, let me get to General Soleimani for one moment. He was killed on January 2nd, 2020 in Baghdad. There is no sorrow over his loss. He was an evil person who caused the death of so many different people. He was clearly a person who is not missed in this world. That's absolutely accurate. But President Trump's actions violated all three of the provisions of the War Powers Act that was passed in 1973 to try to prevent this type of circumstance that happened in Vietnam happening again. Now, why I say all three? Well, first, was there an imminent threat that allowed the president to make this decision without congressional authorization? Well, we've been through a classified briefing, and I'm not going to talk about what was presented in that classified briefing. But I think it's fair to say that we were not presented with the documentation at all that there was an immediate threat against America. The president has not made that case. And we have heard public comments that have been made by administration officials that they did not know about specific threats at that particular time. So, one, the War Powers Act was violated because there was not an imminent threat before the president used military action. Number two, we now know that this had been planned for some time as one of the potential operations that could have been given to the president to respond to Iranian action, that is, taking out General Soleimani. So there was plenty of time to consult with Congress. But yet, before the military action, there was no prior consultation with Congress, the second violation of the War Powers Act. And third, congressional notification and removal of troops within 60 days. The president has not submitted, nor does he intend to submit to Congress an authorization for the use of military force or a declaration of war against Iran. He clearly does not intend to do it. But he's made it clear by his own statements that he will use force again against Iran if he believes it is justified. And his determination of justification is not what Congress intended when it passed the War Powers Act in 1973. Even more urgent, the president claims that he has authorization from Congress. So the president, through his lawyers, have said, well, okay, maybe if we don't have the inherent power, but we have specific authorization that has been previously passed by Congress that allows us to use military action against Iran. So let me go through the two authorizations that are still active by and used by presidents. First, we have the authorization for the use of military force that was passed in 2002. This is the authorization that was passed to go after Iraq. Now, I must tell you, I voted against this authorization. I thought that there was no evidence that Iraq was involved in the attack on our country on September 11th, 2001. I didn't think there was evidence of that. So I opposed that resolution in the House of Representatives when I was a member of the House of Representatives. But that resolution says that the use of force to defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq. We're talking about Iran, not Iraq. How could conceivably the president use the 2002 authorization to claim that he had authority to go after an Iranian general? I don't understand that. I can't figure that out for the life of me. But that argument's been made. And then we have the old fallback of 2001 AUMF that was passed immediately after the attack on our country on September the 11th, 2001. That authorization was passed, and I quote, to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons that planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attack that occurred on 9/11/01. Now, this has been used by many administrations, so it goes back well before President Trump in the misuse of the 2001 authorization. Iran was not involved in the attack on our country on 2001, on 9/11. So how do you use this authorization to say you have authorization now to take out a general in Iran or to use force against Iran? It's clear to me that that is a total misreading of the authority of Congress. Congress never intended, when it voted for that authorization, now 19 years ago, almost 19 years, that it intended that it would be used as it's being used today. That's a total misuse of the authorization by Congress. So in regards to Iran today, there is no AUMF. We have not passed authorization for Iran. The president has already shown that he will act and will not comply with the War Powers Act, and he's likely to use force again that could lead to a lengthy military engagement with Iran. That is a possibility. So we need to pass Senate Joint Resolution 68 because it's specific. It's specific to Iran, that there is no congressional authorization. And just as importantly, if the president wants to use military, he must seek prior authorization from Congress as is envisioned in the Constitution of the United States. It gives the president the power to protect us against imminent threat. So for good reason, Congress has the constitutional powers here. And my generation paid a very heavy price because of the Vietnam War and the way that we got into the Vietnam War without the voice of the United States Congress giving the specific authorization. Let us not cede our responsibility under the Constitution or allow the president to exceed his. I urge my colleagues to support and vote for Senate Joint Resolution 68.